All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jesse Chang, Program Director at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Thank you for joining us today for Nonprofits Mutual Aid and Compliance, presented in collaboration with Propel Nonprofits and LegalCorp. I'm really excited for this session as we know that many nonprofits are being asked, often urgently, to respond to individual and community needs while navigating real questions about compliance, legal risk, and organizational responsibility. So this session is really designed to help you better understand where those boundaries are and where there's flexibility and how nonprofit structures can be used as tools rather than barriers when supporting people in need. A few quick logistics before we begin. The session is being recorded and it will be shared with all of you that have registered for the event. And you are also welcome to drop your questions throughout the webinar, preferably in the Q&A tool, but chat's okay too. And we'll address as many of those questions as we can as we go and toward the end of the webinar. And then closed captions are also available if you want to use those, and it's you can toggle that on or off using the Zoom toolbar. So yeah, we want this time to be practical, clear, and supportive. And our goal is to really help give you the frameworks and guidance that will help you ask the right questions and make informed decisions. So with that, I'm pleased to hand things over to Leah from Propel to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jesse. Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Porter. I'm the Strategic Services Director at Propel Nonprofits. Propel fuels the impact of and effectiveness of nonprofits with guidance, expertise, and capital. We support organizations specifically in the areas of finance, governance, and strategy. And we do that through a number of different services, including our public trainings and resources, consulting, and we are a lender to nonprofits. I am joined today by two other presenters, and so I will hand it over to them to introduce themselves, and I will first pass it to Allison.
Thank you, Leah. Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Wagstrom. I'm a senior loan officer and financial management specialist here at Propel, and I'm looking forward to discussing this topic with you today. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Dunaway. I'm a partner at the law firm of LathropGPM, used to be called Gray Plant Moody. And I specialize in working with nonprofit organizations serving in sort of an outside general counsel and first call for help role. And excited to partner with our friends at Council on Nonprofits and Propel on this conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you both. So I'm just going to ground us, do a little grounding in the current landscape we find ourselves in, which I'm sure is no surprise to any of us, but just to ensure that we're kind of all starting from the same place. The environment we're finding ourselves in is that many nonprofits and organizations are still navigating the impacts of the height of Operation Metro Surge. There have been devastating impacts on the communities they serve, impacts on staff. There have been interruptions or changes to how programs are delivered, or maybe some programs have had to be paused. There have been budget implications due to some of the interruption of those programs and for other reasons, and much more. I think we're still trying to understand the full impacts of what we've been living through. And then we saw tremendous growth in rapid response efforts to support our neighbors. These rapid response efforts came from both nonprofit organizations as well as hyperlocal community and mutual aid efforts. And we're seeing and anticipate even more increased oversight from state and federal government. And then linked to that, shifting public opinions on nonprofits that could impact funder and donor trust. And so understandably, this is making boards and funders more nervous as they continue to assess their risk tolerance and ensure accountability to the community at large. And this isn't over. We are likely going to see more challenges as we experience the full impacts of the federal funding cuts that were implemented last year. We're continuing to see attacks on specific communities that nonprofits serve. There's climate crisis and much, much more, which I realize is not how you want to start a webinar. It's a very sobering grounding, but that's where we're at. And so I think the upside of this is that we saw mutual aid and nonprofits really come together and work in new ways, and that's been encouraging. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So our objectives for today are to first define key terms. We're talking about compliance, and language is really important when we're talking about compliance because it makes sure that we're all on the same page. We want to understand what compliance does and does not require. There are often assumptions made about what's required of nonprofits when it comes to compliance. And we want to identify ways to effectively collaborate with mutual aid. We saw mutual aid efforts play a really critical role in the last several months and think about ways that nonprofits can better partner with mutual aid. We want you to be able to talk confidently to your board and your funders about risk. Some boards are more comfortable with risk, others are more risk adverse. And so we want you to be able to talk to groups wherever they fall along that spectrum. And then our hope is that we share resources with you so that you know where to go next. We know that this work is unending and that there are questions that are going to continue to come up when you're serving communities in creative ways. So our goal is to help you know where to turn with those questions. We may or may not be able to get to all of your questions today. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. And again, we're going to share those resources so that any questions that aren't answered, you know where to go. And then I just want to share a quick note about audience. Our key audience here today is nonprofit organizations because that is the primary focus of MCN and of Propel nonprofits. And so we know that there may be a lot of other interested parties in the space or people that wear multiple hats. And so we would love to be able to speak to everyone's needs, but we're really focusing on speaking to nonprofit organizations today. All right. So want to go over our first objective of just really grounding in key terms. So here are a few key terms that we'll be using today. The first is nonprofit. And today we're talking specifically about 501c3 public charities. So not private foundations or donor advised funds that can also be C3s. They have special considerations, but really public charities. Mutual aid. We're defining that as a voluntary reciprocal exchange of resources and services where community members work together to meet immediate needs, operating on the principle of solidarity, not charity. Mutual aid networks are often decentralized, they're hyper-local or neighborhood-based, self-organized, and are highly adaptable, responding quickly to crisis. And I just want to make a note that mutual aid is not new. It builds on the work that Indigenous people and people of color have been doing for a very long time. And we've seen more of it in the last few years with the uprising and then most recently as well. And it continues. The other term we're going to be talking about is fiscal sponsor. So that's when a nonprofit tax-exempt organization accepts grants or other contributions on behalf of a project or a group that does not have its own tax-exempt status. That fiscal sponsor is also accepting the responsibility to oversee the use of those funds. And then we'll talk about internal controls. And that's a system of practices, procedures, and policies intended to safeguard the assets of the organization from fraud or error and to ensure accurate record keeping. So those are just a few of the terms that we're going to cover today. I believe we're sharing some resources in the chat, and you will get these resources in a follow-up email as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison to talk with us more about compliance.
Thank you, Leah. As we're going to dig into compliance and help you get started understanding what compliance does and does not require. This is about understanding the things you can do to help keep yourself and your organization in compliance with values and accountability standards. First, what does compliance really mean? What compliance in this space really means is not avoiding community work. You are not required to say no to community partners. Working with mutual aid or informal groups does not automatically put your 501c3 status at risk. The thing that you can't do is just pass through money with no oversight. There is no way to do this work and completely avoid risk, but that is true of all the work that we do as nonprofits. You need to do due diligence, thoughtful decision making, and documenting your process and intent to ensure that clearness and clarity are the guiding lights of your compliance. And when rules do exist, they exist to protect the organization, donors, and community members. And I just want to state, you are not required to create a complex bureaucracy to stay compliant. Focus on consistency and clarity. The purpose of this is to remind you that while things might feel new and uncertain, there are pathways to doing this work. You can do community work as a 501c3. Documentation is extremely important in doing that work, as is explaining the case for why the action was taken and how you ensure to report on that action. While there are rules, again, they really are aimed at protecting community members, donors, and the organization itself. Core obligations of being a 501c3 are as follows. You must have a clear charitable purpose. This means that the organization clearly states why it exists and the purpose, and it must qualify as charitable under federal law. In addition, the activities that a 501c3 does must be substantially attached to that mission, not just words on a page, but actions that align with those words. And those activities must benefit the public. It can't be a small group of a clubhouse for a 501c3. It has to be a public benefit. Program and expenses must align with your mission. You will report on what you're doing in the 990 that you are required to file. You need to report on both your income and your expenses in that document, and you're going to have to explain where the money's going. And then finally, board oversight and mission alignment are incredibly important in this work. The board needs to know what is going on and understand any material changes you are making to the programs. Where it gets confusing is when we start doing the work and things start to show up. For example, donor intent and restricted funds. Let's say an organization got an influx of revenue from new donors. They have to answer the question, was this for a specific purpose or was this general operating money? Now, many of you are already familiar with doing that work. It just applies in this work as well. A key thing that donors can't do, a donor cannot designate funds for a specific individual. For example, a donor cannot say, I want you to pay the rent of this specific family, and I'm going to give you money to the nonprofit to do that so I can have a tax write-off. That cannot be done. Record keeping and documentation are something we're going to keep coming back to. When you're doing something new, make sure that you're documenting the process of what you are doing. If you have questions, this is a great time to reach out to your tax preparer or auditor to get more voices on your side. If you're getting ready to do something new and you are unsure, I encourage you to contact those individuals because they're going to have good insights on how to best support the organization and also protect the organization. The other thing is with record keeping, you have to know what you need to document. For example, if you're going to give out money, you need to know who you gave the money to, the amount of the money, and what is it for. You do not have to document immigration status. And if your organization has been doing this work and has substantially grown or changed, you need to look at your internal control documents to ensure that they're being updated to match your new work. Other helpful things to document are who is eligible for your program assistance, what kind of assistance it is, who in the organization is responsible for deciding, and who will communicate with the recipients and the people selected and not selected. Those are key points to keep in mind. Capacity basics. What needs to be in place? Make sure you have internal controls that address who and how much an individual can approve money going out the door. So that's a key part of internal control. It's a keystone of our internal controls to ensure that, for example, your executive director can sign checks for X amount of dollars. Well, what if you need to do a larger check? That information would be available in your internal controls, specifically in your financial policies and procedures. Also, if you're going to take on new work, you need to look at your capacity for accounting within your organization. If you're a volunteer 501c3 with all volunteers doing the work and you take on this work, you might need to spend some money on a new accountant who can help you with all the transactions you're going to have to do. Basic controls like who enters information into the accounting software, coupled with basic controls around finance, ensure that you are protecting the organization. It is really important to make sure that your accounting software and who can access it and how it gets used is part of the conversation. And again, make sure you have clear decision-making roles and responsibilities. Now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, who's going to walk through nonprofits and mutual aid, two different models.
Thank you, Allison. So if you could go to the next slide, what I'm going to do is talk through just at a high level, when we talk about a nonprofit doing community assistance, and what we're talking about is, direct financial aid to people in need versus a mutual aid effort, and then we'll turn to how these two might work together. So just outlining to begin with, then sort of what does it look like when you have a nonprofit doing this work? And kudos to Propel for putting together this resource, and it's on their website, so available for future reference. So when a nonprofit is raising money to support individuals in a community, obviously the money is coming into the organization itself and going into the bank account that's in the nonprofit's name. An important parameter on raising money in this context is that it's for a defined community or type of need that is tied to that organization's mission, and it is not for any specific individual or identified group of people. And that needs to be defined in advance. You need to say sort of who is it or what's the purpose of raising the money for. Again, on this next line, that it's intended to support a specific community or subset of a community. It could be geographic, it could be sort of demographic, it could be based on need, but again, not individual people that are being identified in that fundraising context. When the money's going out the door to support people, whether it's rental assistance or direct financial assistance for emergency needs or other, similar but direct payment to individuals, it will typically not be taxable income to the recipients because it's effectively a gift. The ownership of the assets, when they're raised in the nonprofit, they belong to the nonprofit organization. And as was stated earlier, when they're used, even when they're going direct financial assistance to people, it's for the benefit of the public at large. And here in this context, when we're talking about writing checks to people, you say, how is that a benefit to the public? But there are areas of meeting basic needs where effectively our laws and our public policy is that the community at large benefits when people's basic needs are met. That could be education, it could be, basic need for housing and healthcare and food. That even though there's a recipient who is benefiting, that there's a larger community benefit by ensuring that those basic human needs are being attended to. And then in terms of the disbursement, and again, this repeating what Allison said, the nonprofit is the one that's responsible for keeping documentation around how it selected people, what were the criteria, and then the money going out, who it was paid to, and for what purpose. Contrast that with a mutual aid effort. And by this, we mean it's a group of people who came together, not an organization per se, but an individual or a group of people who are raising money for a specific purpose. Because it's just people doing this work, they can decide how to articulate what the fundraising parameters are, whether it's for a specific family, a specific, for myself, or, for a specific group of people or community. The process for identifying who then is ultimately the receiver is that group of people who raise the money. And most of the online fundraising platforms for mutual aid that are used in mutual aid assign one person to be the owner of the account. So as a technical matter, that's the person who decides. They may agree with the people that they're collaborating with on a more dispersed decision-making approach. But as a technical matter, the website is typically going to look to that one person to give direction around how those funds get dispersed. Similar to the nonprofit, when the money's going out the door, it will typically not be taxable income to the recipient unless we're talking about larger dollar contributions that are below the annual gift tax exclusion, which is currently about $19,000 per year per person. I think for most of the mutual aid that we've experienced in our community recently, they're below those dollar thresholds, and so shouldn't raise a taxable income question. The assets, when they're raised, the money that's raised in that account technically belongs to the person who is the kind of the owner of the account as far as that fundraising platform is concerned. And as I said before, how those decisions get made is something that can be decided by that person or informally by the group of people who are administering the mutual aid fund. On to the next slide. And I'll just say, as we're moving through this, that my world is nonprofits, and I'm a counsel to nonprofits, and so I'm used to saying, oh, there's a nonprofit solution for all of this. And I will say a lesson that I learned in this most recent experience is that we all have a role to play, and there are times and places where the mutual aid model is in fact the most strongest tool, and there are other times where the nonprofit model is the strongest tool, and there's times where they can work together to be the strongest of all. So I think it's really a question of sort of what's the best fit for the need, as opposed to one inherently being better than another. Just to give a couple of examples that we could see in these recent, and we just pulled these looking at different examples. The one on the left is the Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association, which is a 501c3. It raised money for rental assistance. What I like about this example and why we're using it here is that there's just some real clarity around who it is, but then eligibility definition that defines a community, clearly a compelling need in terms of where the need was and what was happening in Minneapolis at the time, but also just clear for anyone who might think that they're eligible or know people who they're eligible, exactly who is eligible, and then very clear instructions around how to apply to receive the funding. The group on the right is a mutual aid group, a group of neighbors on the north side. And to me, it's a good example of a mutual aid example where it's describing the community need, but less precise around who is eligible and how decisions get made, and really maximizing the flexibility that we see with the mutual aid model. And I'm going to hand it over to Allison now. Oh, Allison, you're on mute.
Well, one of us had to do that. Again, this section is specific that I'm talking about for 501c3s. When donor intentions don't match the outcome, you need to ensure that documentation for the funding was clear and that the language you used for intent. So one of the key things that we're talking about is, you notice between the two examples, there were very different language that was used, and that was intentional because the language that was used by the Northside group was really about getting funds that could be determined to be used for the benefit of the neighbors on the North Side. When you are talking about donor intent, you need to ensure that the fundraising language you are using is broad enough to encompass the work, but not so targeted that the funds are restricted to one specific ask, unless that's what you want to do. Use clear language and update the donor frequently on how things are going to ensure that you are communicating with your donors in an effective manner. Double check your website to make sure that it corresponds with the way you talk about fundraising in public and in email. When everything is happening so fast, It's okay to pause and say, we need to take a moment to ensure that we are using funds as the donor intended. If you've been in nonprofits for a while, you know how important it is to make sure you're paying attention to restrictions. And if a donor has restricted funds for a particular program, you need to make sure you use it for that. Finally, you have to ask yourself the questions of what you do if you don't raise enough money, or the flip side, you raise far more. Who gets to make the decision on where the money goes? Is it the board or the staff? It all depends upon what you have done in terms of existing decision-making structures and other decision-making structures going forward. I highly encourage you to read your financial policies and procedures to ensure that you know what guidelines and rules already govern your 501c3. Now I'm handing it back to Leah.
I had to do it too. It's catching, Allison.
Oh no.
So I'm going to talk through some examples of nonprofits and mutual aid working together, and then tips to support nonprofits when collaborating and partnering with mutual aid. There were a ton of examples, and I suspect many examples that are present in the space with us of different ways that nonprofits collaborated with mutual aid, but I'll just talk through three of them. So the first example is a local neighborhood-based organization that was a 501c3 or was approached by parent-teacher organizations from schools in their neighborhood to provide a rental assistance program for families in their community. So the PTOs they knew the families that needed help. They wanted to help raise funds, but they wanted that C3 kind of tax exempt structure to both hold the funds and administer the rent assistance. And so that neighborhood organization co-developed the rental assistance program with the parent-teacher organizations to ensure families in their community could stay housed. And so part of that agreement was they developed an MOU that outlined the criteria that the PTO organizations would use. And then the neighborhood organization essentially entered into an agreement that the parent-led organizations would identify the family based on the agreed upon criteria, and then propose those back to the neighborhood organization, who would then review the applicants and then write the rent checks and distribute the funds that way. So that was a great example of how a nonprofit could really use its tax exempt status to help the immediate need in their community. The second example was foundations partnering with mutual aid. So there were some private philanthropic foundations that contributed to mutual aid groups by donating directly to their GoFundMe campaigns or their Venmos. And this enabled funders to get resources out quickly into the community without having to develop a whole individual grant program to support individuals, because that would take a long time. So that was another example of groups partnering with mutual aid. And then the third example is a food bank partnering with a mutual aid effort focused on food. And they were very public and open about this work, so that is why I'm naming them. But one of the larger community-led food distribution efforts that sprung up was Dios Habla Hoy, or DHH, which is a Latino congregation in South Minneapolis. And they've delivered over 42,000 boxes of food to families who were afraid to leave their homes. Their sign-up list for food exploded overnight, and in a very short time they had over 10,000 families who'd signed up to receive food, and their operation was quickly outgrowing the church parking lot and the storage room that they had in the church that they were using to both store food, create a staging area for volunteers to pack boxes, and deliver. So they partnered with the Food Group, which is a 501c3, a regional food bank and food systems organization. And they're based in New Hope, and they carved out an aisle in their warehouse for storing DHH's food. And then they created a staging area there next to the food where DHH's volunteers could come in and pack food boxes. And so basically they moved all of their packing and storage operation to the food group. And still that partnership still continues today. And so they were able to support, the food group was able to support DHH with the infrastructure that was really needed to grow their capacity over a short period of time. So those are three successful examples. And I think you can go ahead to the next slide. We also have some tips of kind of what helped make those examples successful and things for you to think about as a nonprofit working with mutual aid efforts. And the first is to really have a clear separation of roles so that you're maximizing the impact that each other can have and to reduce risk. There can be a lot of people involved and a lot of moving parts that are moving fast. So it's helpful to have everyone on the same page of who's doing what. I mentioned some in one of the examples that several used quick kind of memorandums of understanding or MOUs to outline those roles, which you can put together really quickly. It doesn't have to be a whole sophisticated thing, but just to kind of talk through some of those details of who's doing what and when. And so you can use that initially and then continue to revisit it and redefine as the work evolves. This role clarity also applies to decision making. Who has power to make decisions, who's advising on decisions, who's out gathering information, and what types of decisions are being made. Several mutual aid groups operate by consensus. And so it's important to know as a nonprofit partner that if you're working with a group that operates by consensus, it can take more time. It doesn't always, but it may be different than how your organization makes decisions. So it's helpful to understand how decisions are made and then to be clear on how you want to make them together. And then as a nonprofit, you may choose to fiscally sponsor a community group. And that can be another way to kind of leverage your 501c3 status. And that could be a good option if the mutual aid group is raising a large amount of money and really needs that tax exempt structure to accept donations. It could be if this mutual aid work is going to continue for an extended period of time versus being just a one-off effort. Or there could be really strong mission alignment between the two groups, and there's a longer vision to continue to do work in the same community. And there you might have opportunities to complement each other's programs. That might be another reason why you might want to fiscally sponsor an organization. And then, as I shared in one of the examples, there are ways to collaborate with mutual aid that don't involve financial support. So I talked about the food group providing space and food storage infrastructure to mutual aid efforts. You may have equipment or other infrastructure that you can share with local efforts. You might have specialized expertise that's important to share, such as food safety, or it could be volunteer best practices or accounting expertise to groups that are just starting to realizing they need to do some bookkeeping. And you likely have connections in your networks that you can share or make that will ultimately strengthen the communities you all serve. All right. When thinking about if and how to best collaborate with local mutual aid, it's important to consider how much control versus flexibility your organization needs in a particular situation and what level of trust you're able to operate with and still be compliant. So in the DHH food group example, DHH was still recruiting all their own volunteers. They were coordinating them, scheduling them to come into the space. And so the food group was fairly trusting of people coming into their headquarters and their building. But that was because they had a strong relationship and strong trust. And that was a risk that the organization felt was worth taking. And so risk tolerance certainly comes into play, both your risk tolerance as an organization, and that can speak to how regulated of an organization you might be. So I think about health organizations that are highly regulated might have a lower risk tolerance than other types of organizations. And then you also want to consider the risk tolerance of your board. And it's important for your board to weigh in on both the potential benefits to the community and the risks to the organizations. I think, understandably, boards really are focusing on assessing risk. And I think it's just as important for boards to assess the purpose and the mission of the organization. And is that being fulfilled to the extent that it can be in this situation? What's key with all of this is to be transparent about what you're doing. And when I say transparent, I mean talk about the work that you're doing, if and when it's safe to do so, and then communicate that back to your donors and to the community. And you want to be strategic in your approach. So many people and organizations jumped in to provide rapid response, which was so needed. And now I think we're in a space of trying to get clear on what's a short-term response and what work will continue long-term. And I think there's a really great opportunity here for mutual aid efforts and nonprofits to really work together to determine how to best support communities longer term. So I know, for example, some food-focused mutual aid efforts are maybe out of money, or folks are kind of trying to think about other ways to do mutual aid in the community. And so there is an opportunity for food shelves, I think, to come in and support maybe some of the longer term food needs of some members of the community. And that speaks to, I think, what Sarah was talking about earlier, is like what's the best space for everyone to play at a given time? And there's a need for all of it. So with that, I think we have some practical scenarios that we're going to talk through. And I will turn it over to Sarah to talk through the first ones.
Thank you. So we could go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk through an example of providing emergency cash assistance. So in this example, you're an executive director of a nonprofit who has some funds and the capacity to raise money and have connections to a mutual aid group that is connected to the community and can be have a role in helping get the money out to the neighbors who need it. So what do you need to do to consider and minimize risk to your organization and the community, and to get the work done and the funding in the hands of the people who need it? So I'm the lawyer. The first thing I'm going to say is check your documents. And this gets back to the point that both Allison and Leah made at the very beginning, which is we need to make sure that the work we're doing here is, and I'm assuming in this example, this is new to your organization, that it's mission aligned. Like, how does this connect with your role in the world, and what the work you normally do is, and honestly, what do your articles and bylaws say, and what did you tell the IRS you were going to do when you got that 501c3 status? So if I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but if this was just completely departed from everything that you've ever done, and you have a hard time articulating how doing emergency cash assistance connects to your mission, that's a moment to pause and to seek legal counsel and talk to your accounting team around how can we be, and what role can we play in this moment of need when we have this potential disconnect with our mission. Because as a technical matter, your C3 status is based on what you said your mission was going to be, what's in your articles and bylaws, and what you told the IRS, and tell the IRS every year when you do your 990. And you can only rely on your C3 status as long as you're continuing to do those things that you said you were going to do. But let's assume in this example that we can articulate why it advances our mission, maybe in a more creative way than we had originally thought, but we're comfortable with that. Then you need to define how the funds are going to be dispersed and what criteria. And again, these can be relatively high level, or they could be very precise, but what you want to be getting at is sort of who are we aiming to benefit, and how are we going to decide who gets that. So thinking about how this might look and how you could partner with this mutual aid organization that we put on the as part of the picture on the left side of the screen is you're doing it. You, the nonprofit, are doing this program yourself. So you are running this assistance program. As I said, you've checked your organizational documents. We're comfortable it aligns with your mission. You create an equitable process. We've defined who is eligible. And as you're going to process applications for assistance, you're going to apply those criteria on a consistent basis and not have favorites. And then you would distribute the funds directly to the individuals with the demonstrated need, and you'll maintain documentation on who you wrote the checks to and what the purpose of it was. And you'll report this on your 990 as one of your program service accomplishments. The role of the mutual aid group in this example, I think, is to be that outreach, that voice and feet on the ground in the community that's helping identify people who are eligible or might be eligible and making sure they're aware that this assistance is available and how to apply, maybe even helping support people in completing the application form or whatever criteria you've defined that people need to submit. On the right would be a different approach, which is instead of running this program yourself, you're going to partner with that mutual aid group and you make, agreed upon criteria around who is eligible, but then the check is getting cut to the mutual aid group and you've delegated decision-making authority to them to then execute, to identify people, to find them, to ensure they meet your criteria, and then they then are distributing the funds to the recipients. And in that context, again, the nonprofit still needs to document who it paid the money to and what it was for. But in this example, it's one check to one recipient, which is the holder of that mutual aid fund. And it was for this program that we've identified.
All right, I will talk about the second example. So there were many nonprofit organizations that submitted information to the Stand with Minnesota guide and website. And so your organization has gained national attention by being listed in this guide. And funds are coming in to support your work, and they're coming in from all over the country. And you normally don't receive individual donations from outside of Minnesota. And so you're not sure how to treat these donations. And so the question here is, what do you need to consider? You can go to the next slide. So the main thing is to think about donor restriction, which means, do they need to be used for a specific purpose, like rapid response efforts, versus being able to be used for any purpose? So in this case, the language you used on the donation page of your website or whatever site you used that was linked to that Stand with Minnesota guide, where you received the gifts, the language used on that website becomes the donor restriction, meaning the gifts need to be used for that purpose. In this case, it's helpful to also consider the language that you submitted to the Stand with Minnesota page, as in this example was likely how nationwide donors found you, but the primary definition or definer is what language was on the website where you collected those donations. Ideally, you want to keep your language compelling and address the immediate needs, but give yourself enough flexibility so that you're not painted into a corner and have more funds than you're able to use for that stated purpose. And I'll share an example about that in just a second. And then again, if your language was really broad and the donor hasn't restricted funds, then you do not have to designate those to a specific program. As always, it's important to be transparent about your use of funds and report back to the community the results of your rapid response efforts through your website and other channels. And so the example that I referred to, you can go to the next slide. The Roseville Area Schools Foundation, this initiative had a really compelling case for supporting the rent needs of families in the Roseville School District. And they make it really clear that they're raising funds to support that immediate need. But then they have this really lovely language at the bottom of their donation page that really says, we're committed to using every dollar to support district families. If funds raised exceed immediate rent relief needs, remaining dollars will be directed to the district food shelf to address ongoing food insecurity and future family needs. So they're saying very clearly what they'll do with the funds and what they'll do if they raise more than they're able to distribute through rent support. So this is an example of a case that's both really compelling and gives them some flexibility as well. So those are a couple of scenarios, and I'll turn it over to Allison to talk through some other considerations and resources.
I just want to highlight that we are going to be taking questions and doing Q&A in the next couple of minutes. So now is the time to get your questions into the Q&A box about what you're wondering about. This next section is to give you more resources to who to speak to after the webinar. First, if you have individual tax questions, if you've been collecting mutual aid, the number one person to speak to is an accountant. You can also speak to legal counsel. Clifton Larson Allen did a rapid response funding toolkit for deployment of community aid. That is an invaluable tool for you to resource. If you're interested in board compliance, again, legal counsel can be really important. Fiduciary duties as defined by the Attorney General. And we encourage you to contact Propel and sign up for one of our office hours where we can talk about compliance in terms of boards and what you need to do. Specifically for raffles, we are going to send you to the Minnesota Gambling Control Board. This board has really worked hard to make things clear and concise about raffles, short-term raffles, long-term raffles, any type of raffles that you might be considering. Next, for nonprofit finance questions, of course, you can come to Propel. We have open office hours again that we'll keep mentioning where you can get time with one of our experts. You also have a tax preparer or an auditor who can help you walk through this experience and be on your side when you're working through some of the concerns. For nonprofit legal questions, we highly recommend LegalCorp brief advice clinics or your own legal counsel. Trust your own knowledge and confidence as a leader. The important thing here is keeping your mission centered and focused on maximizing your resources to do this work. It isn't about going outside and doing something you would never do, but really connecting back to the mission and using your network of people to help you get the questions answered. And now we're ready for questions and answer. So Elizabeth,
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, all. We've got some good questions coming in, but I kind of want to just start with a bigger overview question. Someone had a question about how can nonprofit organizations find mutual aid efforts, or how can nonprofit organizations connect with mutual aid efforts? And Leah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, and I think it can be kind of tricky because mutual aid intentionally was really underground and needed to be to protect their safety and the safety of the community. And so some initial ideas here in the metro, neighborhood specific and neighborhood based organizations often are already doing community organizing, already have existing relationships in the community. And so I think going to them, if that's not you already, can be a great place to start. I think that's where I would go here in the Twin Cities. And then I think just talking to people, your friends, your neighbors. I think what was really beautiful about one of the beautiful things of in the tragedy and horror that happened in the last several months is that it seemed like all of us were wearing multiple hats and had these like side gigs doing mutual aid work. And so I think talking to people is a key one. I saw there was a question too about how to do it in greater Minnesota or rural Minnesota. And I can only speak to my experience growing up in a rural community in that case, but I would there are kind of the hubs in every rural community, whether it's a particular faith community or congregation or the diner or the VFW. But I think there are those places. And I think, again, it all comes back to relationships. And I think what I would encourage folks to do to the extent possible is to continue to strengthen and build relationships in the community so that they're there if and when the next crisis hits.
And I'll just chime in, Leah, to add to that. The ones that we saw really jumping into action most recently were the initiative foundations that are spread out all over. I mean, they're just a real kind of community hub of either doing work themselves or knowing who in the community is doing the work. And then schools, and particularly the social workers at the public schools, really tapped into community needs and having a good sense of who was doing what and where need is present and who was working to solve it. So there's a couple of additional ideas.
Yeah.
Thanks. I have a question about documentation, and so I'm gonna see if Sarah has any answers to this one. So, in an instance where a mutual aid group is fiscally sponsored and the C3 is cutting checks to individuals who are getting aid, what level of detail is needed for how the decision is made on who gets funds? Specifically, what information does the mutual aid group need to give to the fiscal sponsor about how the mutual aid group determines who gets funds?
So this is a one where it's really about, I think, um, aligning expectations between the organizations because there's a lot of room for judgment around
Hmm.
how much information and how much detail, how much rigor we need. I would say the more money we're giving to any individual recipient, the more rigorous both the selection and the documentation should be. So a $500 Target card to help buy groceries, you maybe would be comfortable with someone just certifying that they need it versus, a couple $1,000s for rental assistance. You might want to have more rigor around the need and the fact that the money is going maybe directly to the landlord, and you could come up with more examples. At a minimum, if the nonprofit is writing the checks to individuals or writing checks, so to speak, transferring funds directly to individuals, they do need to know the name of the recipient and the purpose. But beyond that, then it's really around a judgment between the two organizations around how much more we need.
Hmm. There's also a question about, is there similar consideration for non-cash activities, such as like covering an emergency hotel room or things like that? Do we treat non-cash activities the same as cash?
I think the answer is yes, except that it goes to my sort of rigor plus dollar amount equation, which is if you're writing the check directly to a hotel, like one is that the money was then used for what you intended. So that's a helpful compliance. I think of it, different context, but we run into this a lot with scholarship programs where, you're writing the check directly to the college for the student's tuition, that that's what it was used for. I think a
Hmm.
hotel would be a similar analogy in this context. If we're talking about months on end or weekdays on end of staying in a hotel room, well, then you might want to have more diligence. But yes, at the end of the day, it's money out the door for a specific purpose. And so you want to think of it as money, even though it's being sort of given in kind.
Other thoughts from either Leah or Allie on that one?
Mm-mm.
Okay, I feel like there was some talk in the chat and some talk in the questions about, I feel like that $19,000 number is like a hot topic. So I was wondering if you all could, and maybe Sarah, you could start, but talk a little bit more about like what that $19,000 number means, who's it for? And I think there's kind of some misunderstandings or mystique around that $19,000 number that we keep seeing pop up.
So the key thing to remember is that's really it's about, so back up. In the United States, gifts are taxable income, and then there's an exclusion. So you get, the first $19,000 is exempt from that tax. So it's per person per recipient. So classic example is parents giving money to their children. Each parent, let's say there's two kids, each parent could give up to $19,000 to the child each year and have it be covered by that exemption. In the mutual aid context, that threshold comes up in two ways. So technically, remember, a mutual aid fund is owned by a person. So whoever was sort of set up the GoFundMe page is technically receiving that money. If any one donor gives more than $19,000 to that GoFundMe page, that would be over that gift exclusion, and it might be a taxable gift. I don't think for the most part we're talking about dollars, but that's where it comes in for income coming in. And then you also need to think about it for income going out because it's technically a gift from the person who's holding that GoFundMe page to the recipient. And again, as long as it's below that $19,000 per person, then it's excluded as a gift. And again, I think for most of the mutual aid that we were seeing and would typically see, it's well below that dollar amount, but that's where it comes in.
Awesome. There's another question about documentation, right? And I shouldn't be surprised because we talked about documentation over and over and over again. So I'm wondering, we talked about documentation for cash, documentation for like a hotel room or something like that. What about documentation for diapers or household supplies or things like that? Is that similar to what we talked about before?
I'll jump in on that one, but also welcome Leah and Allison. To me, when it's in kind, and particularly things like household items and groceries, that again, I would be documenting that that's what we bought, but less concerned about documenting who the recipients were. The legal requirement is not present. And when you think about the practicality of the need that's being met, it's short-term need, immediate, not high dollars. And so that, again, the dollar amount to the rigor equation is in favor of just get the diapers into the hands of people who need them. And we're going to trust that somebody showing up to an emergency assistance program or getting a home delivery is in fact being truthful that they need it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that you are focused on getting the supplies into the hands of the people who need it and ensuring that you have documentation that you were gifted or given those diapers is the important part, not necessarily the who it went to.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something to that? Hi, I'm here. I'm unmuting unprecedentedly in this. I would also note that you might want to say how much more you have done and use it in a fundraising case. If you are ramping up, so there might be funds that come up, right? So that might be something else you want to consider in your documentation. So you can say we actually gave out 100% more diapers than we ever have in the past, or 200% more, and make a case for funding the new work that you might be doing.
Great point.
That's a great point, Andrea. And I think it goes to like the another part of this, like the fundraising aspect of this or the storytelling aspect of this. Um, that's important work if you want, especially if you want to keep doing it. Okay, there's another question in here, and I don't totally understand it, and I'm going to allow my panelists to also say if they don't understand it, but maybe they do. So, Beth is asking a question about where do churches which do ramp up aid fit into this? Are they more like mutual aid? Do you all know what ramp up aid means?
I think that Beth is asking, where do churches that have ramped up their aid fall into
Got
the
it.
moment?
Okay.
So, we know churches operate a little bit differently. And I think Beth is wondering, are they a little bit more like mutual aid, or do they still need to follow the
Mm,
considerations of a 501c3? And I don't think Allison or Leah, and maybe are particularly experts on churches. But Sarah, I'm curious if you have an answer.
So while at their core, churches are also nonprofits, they might have a different corporate status, but they're 501c3 tax exempt organizations. Their IRS reporting is not, are not required to file 990s, but the rules technically are the same. So the mission alignment is probably a little bit of a lower bar for them just because of the nature of who they are and what their mission is. But in terms of their legal compliance and their accounting compliance, it would be the same as what we've been talking about for other organizations.
awesome. Okay. I am seeing an end to the questions. Are there any, I'm just looking, I know that you all were involved in these efforts in a variety of ways. Are there any other kind of advice or questions that often came up for you when you were doing this work that you want to bring forward and before we wrap up?
I think the one thing I'll just add, which is tangentially related, is we saw a lot of nonprofits also adapt their programs to do rapid response, and we're doing kind of meeting immediate basic needs similar to a lot of mutual aid groups. And I think this was said, but I think it's really helpful to be strategic, and this is where I'll just put my plug in for relationship development with the community as an ongoing part of your work. But they, I think it's helpful for example, I worked with a neighborhood organization that was like, we need to start doing food distribution. We need to start doing supplies distribution. And I live in this neighborhood. So I was like, but wait, and I've been very involved with all of these organizations. But I said, you know what? the food shelf is already doing that. So how can mutual aid step in and fill the gap while the food shelf gets its home delivery program going? Because that was not something that they had been doing before. And so it then was this really beautiful effort of mutual aid really jumping in right away because they were nimble and able to do that. And then being able to refocus their efforts on other supports for the community when the food shelf was able to come in. So I think, there's a tendency for us all to be very urgent, and it certainly is urgent, but it's helpful to be strategic about that response too.
Elizabeth, I'm going to jump in because I see someone put a question in the
Yes,
chat.
all I just needed to do was lure them into saying we were going to wrap up, and the questions started coming in. Do you want me to talk about either of them? Both
Well,
of them?
I was just going to take the Attorney General registration one.
Yeah, go for it.
So the rule in Minnesota is if you raise $25,000 or more on a regular basis, you have to register with the Attorney General's office as a soliciting charity. And it's not a terrible registration. And so my advice always is if you hit that benchmark or you think you're going to hit that benchmark, just go ahead and register. And so that there's transparency. It does require an annual filing, which is basically a copy of your 990. So it's not terribly onerous, and then you don't have to worry too much about whether you're in compliance or not. Other states also have solicitation and regulation and registration and the rules. There's 50 states, there's 50 sets of rules. But the general rule is if you get a one-time donation from another state or a donor in another state, it doesn't likely trigger registration. But if you're actively seeking contributions from donors in that state, then you ought to look at what that state's rules are and figure out whether there's a threshold and a registration that you should follow.
If you are fiscally sponsored, is this something that your sponsoring organization does, or do you need to do it as well?
The fiscal sponsor would need to register. And so if you're the sponsored project and the fundraising for your project is what's going to tip the fiscal sponsor over into needing to register, that would be a good conversation to have to make sure they understand that and that they're registering and that the name, if you're raising money in the name of the sponsored project, that's part of that registration.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a good reminder for nonprofits to make sure that as you're fundraising, you need to ensure that you're meeting the requirements of reporting in the state of Minnesota, which includes if you were to fundraise significant amounts more than you have in the past, the audit threshold is $750,000, and that's just something to keep in mind. Again, it's over an extended period. I think how many years is it, Sarah?
The audit is just 1 year.
Just 1 year.
The 990 is 3.
Yeah. The 990 is 3. So, may we all be overwhelmed with donations for our community, and if that were to happen to you, may you also be aware of where you are in terms of that individual audit threshold.
Okay. Awesome. Jackie just posted some additional compliance support from LegalCorp in the chat, and so that's also a great resource to follow up with. So we've had lots of questions that are great, and we also have shared lots of resources where people can follow up if they need to. So I'm going to pass it back to Allison to kind of wrap us up with our final slides, knowing that you all know how to get into contact with us if additional questions come up.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for all those really great questions. It's great to be in community with all of you doing this work. The key thing that we wanted to leave you with is that compliance is protection, not restriction. It means that looking at your mission, and if an action aligns with your work and that includes community, you can say yes to supporting that work. Community trust is a valuable asset, just like accountability is an asset. Both are important to a nonprofit. When you think about nonprofit structure, you need to include community in that work. Nonprofits can help increase donor confidence. They can protect community members and support longer-term impact because they have ongoing resources. Having an accounting support, clear guidelines on decision-making and fundraising, as well as programmatic intent, is key to doing this work, and we encourage you to keep thinking about it. We hope you have found this webinar to be helpful, and we thank you for all you do for this community. And now I hand it back to Jesse.
Thanks, Allison. And as we come to a close for today's time, I just wanted to extend a sincere thank you to our presenters from Propel Nonprofits and LegalCorp, as well as our ASL interpreters, Kate and Tricia. Thanks so much to all of you for sharing your expertise and help bringing clarity to what can feel like a very complicated topic. And so thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you are leaving with really practical frameworks and guidelines that give you more confidence in how to move forward to support folks in your community through mutual aid. Um, and I wanted to just point out a few resources that we wanted to share that are free and legal compliance resources available to Minnesota nonprofits through a partnership between MC and LegalCorp. This is designed specifically to respond to changing federal and legal environments that nonprofits are facing. So the Nonprofit Legal Services Initiative is there available to address common questions around funding, governance, advocacy, and regulatory changes. So it includes a nonprofit legal help desk, which provides real-time legal support to Minnesota nonprofits, a legal resource library, which is an online resource hosted by MCN with resources addressing legal considerations to protect nonprofits' legal rights, and compliance support, which includes assessments and compliance clinics. Those virtual compliance clinics, we're hosting those each month, and they cover essential legal requirements and best practices for charitable organizations in Minnesota. So the next one's coming up on Thursday, the 16th, and we're adding a couple more dates in July and August. So keep your eyes open for those. And for Propel also is hosting free office hours for nonprofits. And head over to their website to sign up for their awesome newsletters. And they have an upcoming workshop as well, assessing the financial health of your nonprofit organization on April 29th. So we'll share links to all of these resources and upcoming events in a follow-up email. And we'll share the recording to this training as well. So that's all from us. But thanks so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.